Nihilism, Consumerism, and the Return of Meaning, Between the Death of God and Hope. Introduction. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. With these blunt words, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche announced, at the end of the 19th century, the disappearance of the traditional spiritual foundation in the West. This famous proclamation in the gay science illustrated a profound crisis. By killing God, that is, by losing faith in a transcendent truth, Western culture was left without a moral or existential compass. Nietzsche warned that, after the death of God, we would wander through an infinite nothing, feeling the breath of emptiness and the darkness of a sunless world to guide us. In other words, we were facing nihilism, the sense that nothing has ultimate meaning or value. More than a century after those prophetic words, the sensation of emptiness and lack of purpose has become a central theme of our time. Writer Albert Camus, reflecting this modern malaise, began the myth of Sisyphus by stating, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. This chilling phrase sums up the dilemma faced by millions today: does life have any real meaning, or are we cast into an indifferent universe where nothing matters? In recent decades, we have seen how disenchantment, skepticism toward traditional beliefs, and the rise of materialistic consumerism have left many with a profound existential void. The question about the meaning of life is no longer the exclusive concern of philosophers but a daily preoccupation, reflected in soaring rates of depression, anxiety, and even in the tragic increase-induced suicides. Yet alongside this bleak panorama, signs of search and hope also emerge. Paradoxically, in the midst of an increasingly secular and materialistic culture, there are young people turning their gaze back to spirituality and fight in search of meaning. Voices arise calling for the recovery of human and transcendent values and for the repair of the moral fabric that has frayed. This script explores these crossroads in depth. We will examine what nihilism is, how it arose, and what sustains it. We will analyze the role of materialism and consumerism in the dehumanization of society. We will discuss the departure from traditional Western beliefs, with arguments both for and against, and we will explore how the lost sense of meaning might be recovered, including the phenomenon of many young people returning to God. Finally, we will reflect on possible futures, from the darkest scenarios of a humanity adrift to the most luminous visions of a spiritual and humanist renewal. Prepare for a journey of more than 30 minutes through the ideas of great thinkers, philosophers, writers, psychologists, and scientists who have reflected on the crisis of meaning in modernity. With quotes from their works and analysis of cultural currents, we will map the spiritual condition of our time. This journey will take us from the anything goes of nihilism to the fundamental question: how do we rediscover what truly makes us human? Along the way, we will confront both the shadows and the lights of our age. Let us begin by examining the origin of this crisis. Why did the West lose a traditional fight and give way to nihilism? The rise of nihilism, the death of God and the loss of meaning. Nihilism, from the Latin nihil, nothing, is the doctrine or attitude that denies the existence of any inherent meaning or absolute value in life. Put simply, it is the feeling that nothing truly matters. While nihilistic currents have existed in various forms throughout history, it was in modern Western civilization that this term gained major philosophical prominence. To understand how nihilism emerged in the West, we must revisit the profound changes of recent centuries that led to the collapse of traditional belief systems. During the Middle Ages and much of the pre-modern era, European societies were guided by a religious worldview, mainly Christian, that gave a clear sense to existence. God was the source of truth, morality, and the ultimate purpose of human life. Life had meaning because it was grounded in the divine, and values such as good and evil were absolute, backed by the authority of faith. However, beginning with the Renaissance and especially during the Enlightenment in the 18th centuries, this spiritual edifice began to crumble. Several historical processes fueled this shift. Scientific advances and rationalism. Discoveries by figures such as Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, and Darwin dismantled traditional views of the universe and of human origins. The world ceased to be understood as a divinely ordered system and was instead seen through natural laws. The Enlightenment's emphasis on human reason and science led many to question religious dogmas and mysteries. If every phenomenon seemed explainable by natural causes, the idea of a divine plan lost force for some intellectuals. Charles Darwin's 1859 theory of evolution directly challenged the biblical creation narrative, casting doubt on humanity's special place in creation. Secularization and critique of the Church. At the same time, the West underwent a process of secularization. Civil institutions and culture gradually freed themselves from religious control. Revolutions such as the French Revolution 1789 promoted secular ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, sometimes in opposition to ecclesiastical authority. Over time, the Church faced criticism for historical episodes, such as the Inquisition, or for being perceived as in conflict with science, the Galileo affair, and modern thought. In the 19th century, philosophers like Feuerbach, Marx, and Freud argued that religion was a human construction, an illusion or opium, and that God was merely a projection of human desires or a psychological crutch. This eroded the once unquestionable authority of faith. Individualism and the pluralism of values. Modernity brought an exaltation of the individual and their freedom to think for themselves. While this freed many from dogmatism, it also meant there was no longer a single coherent value system upheld by all of society. Each person could now create their own worldview. Over time, the pluralism of ideologies, philosophies, and creeds generated the sense that everyone has their own truth, diluting the notion of a shared truth with a capital T, if all values are relative. Is there anything solid left to believe in? This relativization prepared the ground for nihilism, the suspicion that no value is inherent or absolute, but purely arbitrary. Wars and disillusionment in the 20th century. Although Nietzsche diagnosed the coming of nihilism in the 19th century, the 20th century, with its world wars, genocides, and the nuclear threat, deepened the sense of absurdity. After horrors like the Holocaust and Hiroshima, many asked, how can we find meaning in a world capable of such barbarity? Confidence in humanity's moral progress was shattered for many thinkers, such as the Frankfurt School philosophers, who became deeply pessimistic after WWE. Existentialist thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus recognized the absurdity of existence but proposed that each individual must forge their own meaning in spite of it all. In a way, existentialism is a response to nihilism. It accepts that there is no meaning given by God or nature but insists on the human responsibility to create meaning. Even so, simply acknowledging that initial void confirmed the spread of nihilism in the consciousness of the era. A summary of the break. The departure from traditional Western beliefs did not happen overnight. It was, and still is, a gradual process. Historical factors, scientific, social, cultural, produced a world where God is dead, meaning that the supreme values of all have lost their binding force. Nietzsche described this as both a monumental and a dangerous event. In Das Spoke Zarathustra and other works, he warned that after the death of God would come an era of nihilism. The loss of an absolute basis for morality leads to nihilism. If we no longer believe in a divine order or universal morality, everything seems adrift. In The Brothers Karamazov 1880, novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky issued the same warning through one of his characters: if God does not exist, everything is permitted. This phrase captures the fear of a moral void, without God or transcendence to guide us. What prevents humanity from crossing any boundary? Nietzsche, far from celebrating passive nihilism or despair, sought a response to that void. He saw nihilism as something to overcome by creating new values. He proposed the figure of the Übermensch, the Overman or Superman, as one capable of giving meaning to the earth after God's death, through a revaluation of all values. But that Nietzschean ideal was demanding and elitist. For most people, the disappearance of religious certainties left a feeling of spiritual orphanhood. By the early 20th century, many felt they lived in a disenchanted world. As sociologist Max Weber described it, a world with no magic, no mystery, no sacred plan, only bureaucratic routine, matter, and emptiness. A psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, would later say, life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose. When we lack a way to live for, suffering, or even the tedium of daily life, becomes crushing. Materialism, science, and the belief in only the material. When we speak of materialism in philosophy, we refer to the stance that nothing exists beyond physical matter. In other words, there is no soul, no God, no spiritual entities. Ultimate reality is atoms, molecules, and energy, and every phenomenon, including the human mind, is explained in material terms. This scientific materialist worldview became highly influential in the 19th and 20th centuries alongside the rise of modern science. If nihilism is the sense that there is no objective meaning, materialism often provides the intellectual basis for that feeling, in a universe made only of particles in motion, governed by blind forces. There is no room for cosmic purposes or absolute values. The evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, a leading voice of contemporary scientific atheism, put it bluntly. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. From this perspective, human life is nothing more than a cosmic accident, an outcome of random mutations and natural selection. There is no ultimate way to our existence, each of us is simply a complex arrangement of matter that arose by chance and will one day disappear forever. Taken to its extreme, this view concludes that concepts such as soul, spirit, or even mind are illusions, mere patterns of neurons firing electrical and chemical signals. The existential tension of materialism. Many scientists and philosophers who hold a materialist view, like Dawkins or the philosopher Daniel Dennett, argue that even if the universe has no intrinsic meaning, humans can still live happy and ethical lives by creating their own subjective meaning. They claim we don't need religion or metaphysics to live purposefully, we can find it in our passions, relationships, or projects. Yet others feel that a purely material framework leaves a bitter aftertaste. Writer Isaac Bashevis Singer once quipped, "We are the product of random evolutionary processes, so the biologists say, but we go through the day as if our lives had a purpose." This reveals the psychological tension. Even if one rationally believes in a purposeless universe, there is often an inner need for meaning that refuses to be silenced. The symbolic loss. Scientific materialism has given us enormous benefits in knowledge and technology, but on an existential level it sometimes comes at a cost. It strips reality of symbolic or sacred dimensions. Traditionally, humans saw the world as full of meaning, stars could be gods or angels, nature was God's creation, history had a divine plan. Materialism sweeps all that away, leaving us with a mute cosmos. As one poet put it, "Why does man desperately seek meaning in the stars? Because it pains him to admit they are only fire and gas in the void." That existential wound is one of the forces feeding modern nihilism. Practical materialism, consumerism as a secular religion. There is also practical or moral materialism, better known as consumerism, the belief that happiness and fulfillment come primarily from accumulating material goods, money, and tangible pleasures. This attitude, reinforced by consumer society, functions almost like a pseudo-religion of our era. In the absence of transcendent ideals, many people pour their life energy into acquiring things, the latest smartphone, the newest car, designer clothes, constant leisure experiences. The market promises instant satisfaction, and advertising sells each product as if it could give us a life purpose or identity. The problem is that the pleasure consumerism brings is short-lived. Soon, it must be replaced by another purchase in an endless cycle. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl observed this sharply. When a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, they distract themselves with pleasure. Without eager purposes, we throw ourselves into distractions, shopping, food, entertainment, drugs, casual sex, social media, anything that can momentarily fill the inner void. Frankl understood that excessive consumption is often a symptom of existential emptiness. Society, instead of addressing the root problem, the lack of meaning, offers an endless carousel of stimuli to numb the sensation of absence. The roots of consumerism. This consumerist materialism became possible largely thanks to economic and technological development. After WWE, especially in the West, societies experienced unprecedented material abundance. The American dream and its equivalents promised prosperity through property, cars, appliances. The problem is that the pleasure consumerism brings is shortly what success and happiness with purchasing power. It must be replaced by another purchase in an endless cycle. Analyzed this mentality in works like to observed this sharply. And noted that modern affluent societies tend to define their work by what they have, themselves with pleasure, and display rather than by who they are as persons. We throw ourselves into distractions, shopping, food, entertainment. Modern consumers can be identified by the formula, anything that can momentarily fill the inner void. In this understood losing possessions feels like losing honest existential emptiness. People become trapped in a cycle, instead of addressing the momentary relief, the lack of meaning, offers like endless carousel of stimuli to numb the sensation of absence. So they must consume more and more to sustain their self-esteem and inner peace. This consumerist materialism problem is that no material object to economic and technological development. After WWE, especially in the West, societies experienced unprecedented material abundance. The American dream and its equivalents promised prosperity through property, cars, appliances. Popular culture began to equate success and happiness with purchasing power. Philosopher Rich Fromm analyzed this mentality in works like To Have or To Be, and noted that modern affluent societies tend to define their work by what they have, consume, and display rather than by who they are as persons. Fromm put it in a striking formula. Modern consumers can be identified by the formula, I am igual a what I have and what I consume. In this scheme, losing possessions feels like losing honest identity. People become trapped in a cycle, consumption provides momentary relief, because having feels like security, but that relief is temporary, so they must consume more and more to sustain their self-esteem and inner peace. The deeper problem is that no material object can give a lasting meaning to life. Things can provide comfort, fun, or status, but they cannot answer questions like who am I, or why do I exist. On the contrary, when we make objects the center of our lives, we end up turning ourselves into objects. We start valuing people for their appearance, their material success, or even for the number of likes they get on social media, a kind of quantified social capital. Our self-image depends on external variables, salary, clothing brands, the perfect body, and we may end up treating each other as means rather than ends. That is precisely what it means to dehumanize, to reduce the human being to a thing. Consumerism and dehumanization, humans as objects and laboratory rats. The critique of dehumanizing consumerism has been addressed by many thinkers over the past century. Erich Fromm, whom we cited earlier, warned that if this trend continued, the modern human being would become a mere consumer, a passive being subjected to a mechanized reality. In 1968, Fromm published The Revolution of Hope, where he predicted what the individual of the year 2000 might look like, excessively individualistic, isolated, and subordinated to technology. Living inside a kind of mega-machine society. In that mega-machine, a growth, man will be a slave to technology, losing freedom, health, and happiness in order to keep the gears of production and consumption turning. It's the image of a hamster on a wheel, or, to use another metaphor, laboratory rats in an experiment. How we become laboratory rats? Think about how large industries and corporations operate today. They are constantly experimenting with our behavior to steer it toward consumption. Social media platforms, for example, use algorithms that test different psychological tricks, notifications, variable rewards, infinite scrolling, to hook our attention, used as a lab rat is trained with food rewards. We are subjects of market research, /B tests, neuromarketing studies. Every time we browse online, we leave a trail of data that is analyzed and used to influence our buying decisions, or even our political opinions. The now famous phrase "if you're not paying for the product, you are the product" captures this reality. We don't pay to use certain platforms because, in truth, we, our data, our time, our attention, are the merchandise being sold to the highest advertising bidder. In this way, human beings become a part of cost-benefit calculations as units of consumption, reduced to numbers and statistics. Cultural and moral objectification. Consumerism has turned us into objects on multiple levels. One is the commercial and technological level we just described. We are exploited as users for others' profit. Another is cultural and moral, the obsession with consumption as seeped into how we relate to each other and how we see ourselves. Values such as human dignity, compassion, and authenticity take a backseat to commercial values like competitiveness, productivity, and image. In some environments, people are treated as resources, think of them as human resources, or as audiences to be captured, rather than as beings with intrinsic worth. The thingification of life. Philosopher Hannah Arendt spoke of the thingification of modern life. The more we are dominated by bureaucratic or economic systems, the more we lose our spontaneity and moral judgment, becoming replaceable parts. The result is a dehumanized society. As Fromm warned, in such a society men and women will lose a fight in human values and only technical and material values will be considered valid. That means we will judge everything in terms of efficiency, utility, or profit, while ethical and spiritual questions fade into irrelevance. Fromm cautioned that this would lead to a profoundly unhappy society, because it betrays the essential needs of the human soul. Isolation and the loss of community. Another sign of dehumanization is isolation and the loss of community. Consumerism puts us in mode instead of we mode. It encourages us to chase personal gain and competition rather than cooperation. Ironically, in a hyper-connected digital world, many people feel more alone than ever in real life. Replacing community with consumption creates apartments full of things but empty of shared life. Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman spoke of liquid modernity, where even human relationships become fragile and disposable, like consumer goods to be used and thrown away. Dating apps, for example, often promote a view of people as if they were products in a catalog. All this contributes to a sense of rootlessness and lack of meaning, because human beings draw much of their sense of purpose from authentic human connections, family, friendship, community, love. Things that are difficult to cultivate in a culture centered on selfish consumption. Infantilization and trivialization. Another disturbing aspect is how consumerism infantilizes and trivializes us. We are constantly urged to seek the next instant gratification, like children chasing candy, rather than develop virtues such as patience, depth, or sacrifice for others. We become eternal adolescent consumers, more worried about the latest gadget or trend than about transcendent matters. And when serious problems, for example, sometimes promote a view of the meaning of life like products in a powerless or empty, because we were never trained to a sense of uprootiness and lack of meaning, because human beings derive a great deal of purpose through authentic human connections, family, friendship, community where consumerist dehumanization reaches that are difficult to cultivate in an environment centered on Huxley's brand new world. A society kept happy through a mix of how consumerism infantilizes or trivializes bonds, and a drug gadget soma that erases to seek the next immediate gratification, like children chasing after sweets, instead of developing virtues like patience, depth, or self-sacrifice for others. We become eternal adolescent consumers, more concerned with the latest gadget or trend than with transcendent questions. And when serious problems arise, social crises, death, the meaning of life, we might feel powerless or empty, because we have not been educated to face them, but rather to escape them by buying more entertainment. Dystopian literature has imagined extreme futures where consumerist dehumanization reaches its peak. A classic example is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. There, society keeps everyone happy through a combination of constant consumerism, promiscuous sex without bonds, and a drug gadget soma that eliminates any discomfort. In that world, traditional values such as family, religion, profound art, or philosophy have been suppressed because they generate instability. The only thing that matters is to produce and consume, while human beings, created en masa in laboratories, live in superficial hedonism. Huxley warned that humanity could voluntarily surrender to slavery if enough pleasure and comfort were offered in exchange. This is perhaps the darkest phase of materialism, not a tyranny imposed from outside, but a voluntary surrender of our freedom and dignity in exchange for the daily dose of consumption that keeps us from thinking. Returning to our present reality, we see worrying symptoms, mental health crises, anxiety, depression, the existential void reported by many young people, addictions, not only to substances, but also to shopping, gambling, and social media, violence stemming from the depersonalization of others, etc. All of this indicates that the purely material path is not nourishing our spirit. Something is missing. At this point, two key questions arise: how did we allow this detachment from spiritual and humanistic roots to happen? And is it possible to reverse it? To answer, let's first consider what was lost when we turned away from traditional Western beliefs, and what the arguments for and against this change have been. Then we will explore paths to recover what was lost, if it is desirable to do so, or to construct new forms of meaning. The departure from traditional beliefs, liberation or emptiness? For centuries, the West was rooted in what we might call the Judeo-Christian matrix of values and beliefs. This included faith in a personal God, morality based on divine commandments, hope in a transcendent life, heaven, immortal soul, and a view of the human being as a creature made in the image of God, with inviolable dignity. Also part of that tradition were the sense of religious community, shared celebrations, Christmas, Easter, and spiritual comfort in the face of pain. Turning away from traditional beliefs meant weakening or abandoning many of these elements. However, this departure has not been seen by everyone in the same way. There are both positive and negative views, optimistic and pessimistic stances regarding secularization. Let's present them in contrast. Those who celebrate the departure from traditional religion often argue that it was a positive liberation. From this perspective, the emancipation from the church's authority allowed for the development of science, secular education, and critical thinking. There would no longer be untouchable dogmas, and humans could freely use reason to investigate the world, which resulted in medical and technological advancements, etc. They also argue that many Western societies became more tolerant and open after abandoning rigid religious positions that had sometimes fostered wars, intolerance, or repression, e.g., the European religious wars or punishments for heresy. For these critics of tradition, autonomous morality, not based on divine commands, allows for a more humanistic ethic, centered on the real well-being of people here and now, instead of ancient sacred rules. An example, secular ethics facilitated discussions on sexual and reproductive rights, gender equality, etc., where traditional morality often imposed taboos. In summary, from this point of view, secularization brought progress, pluralism, and intellectual maturity. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire or Thomas Paine saw organized religion as a superstition to be overcome so that humanity could light its path with reason. In the 20th century, philosophers like Bertrand Russell continued this stance, claiming we can have compassion, beauty, and meaning in life without resorting to supernatural myths. Finally, there is the argument of abuses. Some justify the move away from religion because certain religious institutions lost moral authority due to scandals, e.g., corruption or sexual abuse cases in the church. Disillusionment with institutions led people to seek spirituality on their own or to abandon it altogether. Those who mourn or criticize the loss of traditional faith paint the opposite picture. They see it as a source of moral chaos and existential emptiness. For these thinkers, religion, despite its flaws, fulfilled an irreplaceable function. It provided social cohesion, comfort, purpose, and a shared ethical code. With its erosion, society is said to have fallen into value confusion and unbridled individualism as previously described. T.S. Eliot, a 20th century poet, wrote that separating Western culture from its Christian heritage was like trying to keep fruit while cutting it off from the tree. It might seem for a while, but would eventually rot once disconnected from its roots. Contemporary philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre have argued that after the Enlightenment, we failed to create a convincing foundation for secular morality, and that today moral discourse is fragmented and emotivist. Everyone used voices feelings, with no common ground. From this perspective, the liberation from the religious framework turned out to be a loss of orientation. Moreover, some argue that religiosity fulfills the psychological needs, belonging, hope in the face of death, a sense of awe, that the secular materialist worldview leaves unmet. Nietzsche himself, though an atheist, feared that in killing God we would end up drowning in nihilism unless we found something great to take his place. And writers like G.K. Chesterton warned, when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. This phrase, often attributed to Chesterton, suggests that the spiritual void don't remain empty, but that other, less solid or more erratic beliefs fill that gap: strange cults, political idolatries, extreme nationalisms, totalitarian ideologies, or pseudosciences. In fact, The 20th century witnessed the rise of political religions such as fascism and Soviet communism, which many analysts interpret as quasi-religious attempts to fill the void left by fight with their own dogmas, profits, and utopian eschatologies. The results were disastrous. Today, one could argue that consumerism or the worship of the market is another form of secular religion that now occupies the vacant space. In short, the departure from traditional beliefs is a complex phenomenon with both light and shadow. There is no doubt that it brought with it degrees of personal freedom and diversity of thought. On the other hand, it also placed the full weight of individual responsibility on each person. Now, every individual must forge their own system of meaning from scratch. For some, this is exhilarating, for others, overwhelming. The philosopher Kierkegaard, already in the 19th century, described the nearly paralyzing anxiety experienced by the individual when absolutely free to choose in matters of existence. He called it the dizziness or imbalance of freedom. Traditional religion, for all its restrictions, provided a clear framework that helped ease that burden. One knew who they were, where they came from, and where, supposedly, their soul was going. The crucial question now is, can, or should, we recover those lost beliefs in some form? Or must we build something new? In the next section, we will look at a surprising current trend. After years of growing secularism, there are signs of a spiritual revival among the Jews. We will explore why some young people are returning to God or seeking new forms of faith, and what this means in the midst of a nihilistic and materialistic world.